I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I'm running to be the next Rhode Island Attorney General. I've practiced law for the last 16 years, 12 of them in the office of the Attorney General, so I have the knowledge and experience to do that job at a high level. I'm not here to fight for a political agenda. I'm not here to fight for a special interest. I'm here to fight for the rights of every Rhode Islander, no matter where you come from or no matter what your background is. I'll need your votes on September 13th for the primary election and November 8th for the general election. If you have any questions about where to vote or how to vote, please contact your local Board of Canvassers or the Secretary of State's office or website. I'm not running to be just another politician. I'm running to be a public servant who can serve as a much-needed check and balance on the state of Rhode Island to root out the corruption both inside and outside of our system. We need your support. You can visit my website at chas4ag.com to learn more about me, donate, or volunteer your time. I'm Chaz Kalenda, and I approve this message.
To take home the Golden Gloves, you've got to put in the work, and you've got to be tough as nails. Ashley Kalis was driven to achieve. Today, Kalis is still fueled by that same hope, grit, and determination. A mother of 3 school-aged boys and successful business owner who ran testing and vaccination sites across the state. Kalis is the fighter Rhode Island needs right now because it's time for a change. Ashley Kalis for governor.
Good evening. Welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today is Nick Dranias. He's the general counsel of Prospera Honduras. He'll tell us a little bit more about what that is and their efforts to bring prosperity, freedom to Honduras, to a semi-autonomous zone called ZEED. And we will talk about who has been resisting those efforts and why some people may not want to see this sort of innovative approach to property and to residential living, residential and commercial living, why these zones have created a maelstrom of media publicity and what can be done to address the situation with truthful and accurate information. Nick, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we launch into the discussion of what Prospera is and what Z's are, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up with this project?
Well, thank you, Irina. It's a real honor to be on your show. I've watched you participate in the marketplace of ideas as an expert in a variety of fields, and I think the way we connected was after I read one of your excellent columns. So I appreciate that you found time on your show for me. My background is in law and policy. I've been practicing law for over 25 years. I'm licensed in 5 U.S. jurisdictions. I have a majority of my career now in constitutional litigation. I spent most of that time at the Goldwater Institute and the Institute for Justice in Arizona and Minnesota's chapter, respectively. In addition to that, I was a public policy analyst and general counsel for Goldwater Institute and studied how to make government work to produce prosperity, jobs, economic growth, and what the essence of good governance really is. And so from that background, I was really excited about joining the Honduras Prospera team back in 2018 when it was mainly a venture by its parent company, New Capital. And I was brought on board by our CEO to apply my knowledge in constitutional law and policy analysis to help develop a full stack of best practices in governance that in a single generation could transform Honduras into a first world country capable of having jobs and economic activity and income comparable to any other the first world nations in the Western Hemisphere. So that was my job. That was my purpose. My background also includes a win in the U.S. Supreme Court, so I'm very familiar with how constitutional issues arise. And one of the most important things that we have to deal with in the Honduras Prospera situation are claims of or challenges to the ZEDE regime, which is the Zones for Economic Development and Employment. That's the Spanish acronym ZEDE. It's just a special economic zone. And those challenges, I believe, are completely meritless, and we can talk about that in the coming interview.
So before we get to those special economic zones, why Honduras? What made Honduras the perfect target for Prospera and for this development? Had it been tried anywhere else before that?
Well, first of all, it's very challenging to find a government that is willing to allow for the level of autonomy. And we're not talking complete autonomy, but we're talking a level of autonomy that allows for the deployment of the full stack of best government practices. Honduras was a leader in that respect back in 2013, 2014, when they adopted the ZEDE framework as both a constitutional amendment and a statute. And so what Honduras created was the legal authority for a small area of the country, a zone, to immediately drop in all of the best public policy practices, all of the sorts of things that generate success and prosperity for places like Singapore or Hong Kong or Dubai or the United States for that matter, and in one place without political interference and without corruption tainting it from the outside. Because as you know, Latin American countries and Honduras in particular have a challenge or two in their background when it comes to the rule of law, and they were self-conscious of that. So they knew that it was important for a zone such as a ZEDE to have a degree of insulation from the outside political and private forces that may try to corrupt the deployment of what really works to generate jobs and income and economic activity, which is the rule of law.
So the project was conceived back in those days when it was still possible to really develop something like that, and based on the models of those entities, those governments that you just mentioned. What happened then? Recently, after all, Honduras had elections that resulted in a completely different government coming to power. How did that affect the implementation of the project? And actually, before we get into that, what exactly, how is this particular community model different from a normal Honduran city?
So what's different about the way that Prospera ZEDE, that's what we call it, Honduras Prospera is the private company, the jurisdiction is Prospera ZEDE, and what makes it different is that it is literally the full stack of good governance practices from tax law to regulatory law to the base law. And what the zone is a common law zone, first of all. If you look at studies of economic growth and entrepreneurial activity, common law countries like the UK, like Canada, like the United States, like Australia, like New Zealand, and common law adopted jurisdictions like Hong Kong, Singapore, Dubai, all of these jurisdictions vastly outstrip the civil law world. And the difference between the two approaches in base law is that the common law world assumes that you have sort of a presumption of liberty, that you're free to act. And the law is, in general, applying simply a number of principles of reasonableness. So you are judged after the fact based on whether or not you cause harm. And if you don't cause harm, you're largely free to pursue new dreams and opportunities. Whereas in a civil law situation, it's very ritualized. There's a notary required for everything. The law speaks to almost everything that you might encounter in the course of your business. And to really know what you're doing, you have to be super sophisticated, and you have to spend a lot of money on lawyers and notaries. And so as a result, these two different systems, just at the base law level, at what it takes to form a contract, what it takes to form a company, what it takes to engage in marketing. The differences between those two systems at those very base levels, common law versus civil law, is that the common law jurisdictions of the world have much more entrepreneurialism, much more economic development, much more investment and job creation than civil law nations. So critical to our zone is its base law of common law. And then built on that are really innovative approaches to regulation. And I'll summarize it. Essentially, our regulation involves 2 or 3 principles. I'll simplify it to 2. One, we offer full reciprocity to businesses and individuals operating in professions in about 30 countries. So if you come to Prospera, you can operate inside of Prospera as if you were in the country of your preference. And we have a variety of ways to monitor that and ensure that it's done properly, but that's number one. So we make it really, really easy for nearshoring, for right-shoring, for relocating businesses out of less stable parts of the world to closer to the Western Hemisphere or closer to the United States. And that's a very, very attractive feature. We're finding that there's tremendous amounts of capital that want to mobilize to relocate a lot of businesses into Latin America. And the idea that you can operate once you get inside Prospera as if you were where you were before, or if you were in the United States or the UK or wherever, very, very attractive to people. Now, the other component of our regulatory regime is to outsource the regulatory business, the day-to-day regulation, to what we call regulatory insurers. And the first regulatory insurer is the governmental body itself. We call it the regulator of last resort. And basically, everyone who wants to operate in a regulated business has to get a level of insurance that covers any harms they might cause. It's actually very similar to a combination of commercial liability coverage and fidelity bonding, if you're familiar with that. And what's cool about it is the insurance company issuing that policy has a direct profit interest in not over-regulating or under-regulating. So if they provide standards or oversight rules to govern you as the person holding that policy, an insurance company, because of the profit motive, is not going to want too many claims, so it's not going to want to under-regulate, and it's not going to want to waste too many resources investigating you, so it's not going to want to over-regulate. And so our second prong of our system is to outsource to regulations by insurance companies, with the government itself of the zone serving as sort of the last resort insurer. But our hope is that as time goes on, more and more insurers will enter the market, and then you'll have a competition among the bodies that do regulation. So not only do you have the ability to operate inside the zone as if you're in one of 30 countries, whatever your choice is, you also you're not in a situation where you have monopoly regulatory authorities that can be abusive or irrational or slow. You're going to have access to a competitive marketplace. And unlike most incentives that may exist for regulators, which is perhaps to over or under regulate, insurance companies, because they have a stake in the outcome of that insurance, will tend to optimize things. It's not going to be perfect. Nothing in life is perfect, but you're going to have a regulatory system that really is geared towards optimizing, the best of all possible worlds. So that's the regulatory framework and why we need a large measure of autonomy. Then there's also the tax component. So we are not a tax haven. We want to generate tax revenues, in part because we owe the government of Honduras 12% of our tax revenues, and we want to make sure that the government of Honduras is aligned to our success. And so we want to generate revenues. But we don't want to have stupid taxation or taxation that penalizes economic growth. We want taxation that promotes economic growth, that promotes productive activity. And so we view there to be three footings to the stool of taxation. One, a flat income tax that involves a tax in the simplest possible way, where we basically deem for individuals 50% of their gross income as taxable at 10%. And there's very few deductions or exemptions, if any. And then also an income tax for corporations, which deems 10% of their gross income taxable at 10%. And again, no real exemptions or deductions. You don't have to itemize your expenses. You don't have to, play games with tax avoidance vehicles. Just a very straightforward income tax that doesn't take more than 30 seconds to a minute to fill out if you have your gross income tax or your gross income in the zone available to you. And that's point one. We deprive accountants and tax lawyers of a whole lot of business and save people money. Sorry, guys. Don't worry, you got plenty of other jurisdictions in the world to work. The other thing we have is a retail VAT, which is in substance very similar to a consumption tax. And it boils down to treating 50% of the price at the retail level as retail value add, and then taxing that at 5%. Effectively, it's a 2.5% consumption tax. And again, taxes are generally pretty bad when it comes to promoting economic activity, but if you're going to tax one thing or another, it's always better to tax consumption than savings or investment. And then the third component of our tax regime, which is currently suspended due to a component of the Zeta court system not being fully operative. But when that court system is fully operative, we will reactivate it. And that is the land value tax. We have a 1% land value tax. And this is the tax that both the left and the right in the economic world unite as the best, or in Milton Friedman's words, least bad tax. And the reason for this is quite simple. Land values tend to increase by the quality of governance in almost a one-to-one fashion. So it's a just way to create revenue for the government. If the government makes a solid rule of law environment that people want to move into, land values tend to go up. So it's fair to tax that increase in land value. The other thing that's nice about it is that when you build things on land, the value of your improvement outstrips the growth in the value of your land. And so a really good way to minimize the effective cost of your land value tax is to build a productive improvement on that land so that the cost of it is defrayed because you'll be generating income from this improvement. And so the land value tax is the only tax that actually promotes economic development, which is really, really important in a greenfield area, which is where our zone is. There's nothing there. And we want to bring in entrepreneurs that are ready, able, and willing to invest. I mean, we have nothing against speculation, but we don't really want a lot of speculation at this stage in what we're doing. We're trying to build things out. We're trying to grow revenues. We want to deliver to the Honduran government their fair share of those revenues. And we want to have a tax system that is not a tax haven, but is maximally efficient so that everyone feels like it's a fair system. And so that's in essence our system. And for that system, that overall system to work, there's one last component, and that is dispute resolution. As much as we may enjoy particular aspects of decisions in Honduras, the court system there is very, it's under a lot of question by a lot of people, both left and right. And so what is really important is for us to step outside of that regime for most things in life. You can't avoid the courts completely, but what we do is we have a default arbitration system, private arbitration system for all disputes that arise within the zone. We basically created a arbitration center in Texas with retired judges, former justice of Arizona Supreme Court, former chief judge of the Court of Appeals in Arizona, a bunch of international experts from Chile and Australia, and a legal scholar formerly with the Cato Institute. So they are the arbiters. Everyone can know that this is sort of your default arbitration center, but we don't limit people to this. Again, we believe in competition even when it comes to governance. And so if people want to choose a different arbitration system, they can contract around our default choice, and they can choose any other arbitration system they want. And then even if they fail to do that, if they don't feel comfortable using our center, they can always go to AAA, American Arbitration Association's International Center for Dispute Resolution. So the great thing about Prospera is you get the best tax practices, the best regulatory practices. You get a impartial rule of law venue for deciding all the usual disputes that might arise in doing business and in investing. And you could do that in Honduras, which has a tremendous amount of underutilized talent. One of the things that I really got to highlight about Honduras that makes it very valuable, it's not just that they were innovators in this space and came up with this law almost 10 years ago, but they have many public universities that are churning out highly talented, bilingual young people who have nowhere to go. Well, we can give them a place to go. There's a huge amount of demand for English, Spanish speaking professionals, young professionals, accountants, engineers, lawyers, architects, coders, huge amount of demand around the world, and we can take the excellent output of the public universities in Honduras and give them access to the international job market where they can really shine.
So at what point did this community become operational, and how is it structured? I got to see a bit of the presentation by your colleagues, but I'd like to share that with the public at large who have not been privy to that discussion, just for them to get an idea of what's included, what it looks like, and how it functions.
Well, I would encourage everyone to go to prospera.hn to see our main website. But there's going to be other new websites coming out very soon to clarify what each section of the zone is like. But here's where we are today, and I'll tell you how we got there. We have 1,000 acres in the zone. We have most of that acreage on the island of Roatan, about 20 miles off the coast of Honduras. We have a minority, but a significant chunk, 300 to 400 acres, a greenfield space near the town or the city of La Ceiba, which has a port. And the dynamic we're attempting to create in the zone is the dynamic between Zenshin and, forgive my pronunciation, Zenshin and Hong Kong, where you had a sort of a industrial or manufacturing base across the ocean or the bay from the actual knowledge economy, or the light manufacturing knowledge economy. So we want to have that kind of dynamic. So how did we get here? Well, we first broke ground on the first building called the Beta Building almost 2 years ago in 2020. We got our ZEDE authorization in late December 2017. Now, we spent most of the first couple of years and most of our resources developing that stack of good governance. You know, everything from the common law to the regulatory system to how the tax system works. You know, figuring all that out took a tremendous amount of resources, bringing in experts from all over the world. Not just me. I'm just one of many. And developing that took a lot of time. It took the majority of the first 2 years to develop. But at the same time, we were gradually, you know, on the business side, acquiring interests in different properties, encouraging Hondurans who had land holdings to join us. And that also took a little bit of time as well. I would say that the real launch date for things on the ground was in May 2020, right in the middle of COVID, which didn't help anything, but we managed to plow through it. And today we have an area of property that was brought in by a Honduran family. It's very prominent on the island, that includes a resort area that was under litigation for many years and is falling apart. And we've rehabbed it, and it did a soft opening a couple of months ago. It's bringing in all kinds of new interest in business. And then we also have a section where we have a robotics factory going in, and where they're using robots to create Zaha Hadid, the architecture firm's designed homes. And then we have a 15-story tower going up, first of 3. I think they're at floor 5 right now. We should have it completed in about 6 to 9 months. That's going to be mixed use, a lot of hot desks and opportunities for offices in the zone, both from Honduras and from around the world to operate within. And then we're close to landing, if the Honduran government can settle down and approach us in a more reasonable and productive way. We're about to land some major investments from businesses looking to relocate from the Far East for the La Ceiba piece. So that's where we are today.
So how many people are you seeking to attract, and how many people are functioning with this zone already? And who are they? How do you find them? How do you recruit? I know you mentioned some of the international businesses, but what kind of businesses have already bought in, and who else is part of the community?
Well, currently, we've got over 500 e-residents. So we brought in the team from Estonia that created their e-residency system. And you can go to eprospera.hn and become an e-resident of various kinds. And we have over 500 e-residents. Of the 500 that are e-residents, we probably have 300 to 350 people working inside the zone right now, mainly on the island. And then apart from that, you have all the downstream effects or the upstream effects of the economic activity that is generated by that, which is mainly construction. And as I indicated, we have sort of a remote work industry that's starting to grow. It's not a call center. It's basically connecting high skill college grads from Honduras with the job world outside of Honduras. What we're trying to accomplish is something along the lines of 10,000 residents actually living inside the zone within the next 6 years. We have plans of raising. We've already raised $80 million to do what we've done. The majority of which was after the recent change of administration, because we can discuss later, that the investors saw an opportunity there, despite the anti-Zaidi rhetoric. But we're hopeful that if the Honduran government can see the win-win that's involved in what we have in the zone, that we'll be raising $500 million by 2025. And alongside of that, we're hoping that we'll have about 5,000 to 10,000 people working in the zone, not necessarily living in the zone, because the living part's hard. We got to build things. This is mostly greenfield, but we're hoping to have 5,000 to 10,000 people working in the zone. And mainly in light tech, light manufacturing, light industry. Again, outsourced or leased employees in higher end type jobs. Medical services. We have some innovative medical groups that are coming in. We're hoping to have a energy component that's really unique and high tech, and can't freely get into a whole lot of it, but it would bring a very, very cheap, very safe, very environmentally friendly form of electricity to Honduras that it likely would not otherwise obtain without the legal framework that we have. So there's a lot of exciting things that are in the works and underway. But basically what we're trying to do is replicate what happened in Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
If you're familiar with the history of Dubai, it was basically a crossroads for camel herders in the late 80s, and then they came in there with the proper legal framework, beginning with the common law, and then a reasonable regulation system, and then rule of law, impartial dispute resolution. And within 15 years, you had most of what you see today. I mean, a mini Manhattan grow out of it. And ultimately, this is what it's all about. We believe that with the right software, and that's what we call the legal system, the hardware that you find in most countries, and certainly in Honduras, can achieve anything. They can achieve what we've achieved in the United States. If you look to Israel and see how quickly Israel became a first world country from a war zone and ambiguous, talk about ambiguous jurisdictional issues. I mean, look at what emerged there. If you have the right software, you can pretty much any hardware is going to run it well. And that's just the nature of humanity as we believe it. So we believe that Honduras will be in a time scale very similar to Singapore, achieving levels of growth and wealth and economic opportunity that you saw in Singapore, that you saw in Dubai, that you see, used to see more robustly, but you still kind of see in Hong Kong. And that you saw in the early years of the United States, and that you see in Israel, and that you see in so many other places in the world that have the right governance, the proper good governance for human beings to flourish.
Now, this is the part that gets a little bit controversial, because, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a change in government in Honduras. How does the new government feel about this project, and how do you guarantee the continuity of it from what it used to be to now? And moreover, more importantly than the government, how does the election of the officials who hold the current views, how does it reflect on the population and their view of projects such as yours?
Well, to be candid, it's a very challenging environment. So one of the things that's been a challenge is that Prospera grew up and was a policy choice of the previous administration. The previous administration had some, to borrow a term, some very bad dudes in it. And many Hondurans rightly despised the previous administration. What has been a challenge is that the simple fact that we got our concession going has tainted it in the eyes of many Hondurans, and certainly the current administration. And it's understandable, but it's not justified. The reality is we uphold the highest levels of integrity, better transparency than anywhere else in Honduras. As a U.S. company, we're subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which makes sure that there's never been and never will be any sort of bribery or anything else involved in what we're doing. What we were fortunate is that the folks in the prior administration, basically the very high integrity elements of that administration. Administrations have bad elements, and administrations have good elements. We were fortunate in that our immediate oversight, the group that approved our concession, at least 2 and arguably 3 to 4 of the 5 people running the main branch of that, extremely high integrity, Harvard educated in one case, very, very much founding fathers in terms of their patriotism for their country and their motivation. So, the inside story is that we had what good people existed in the last administration. We had an intimate, oversight relationship with, which was very beneficial. We tried to stay out of the politics of it. We recognized that there were bad elements in the past administration, and we only engaged as much as we had to. But nevertheless, we got painted with that brush, and most of the anti-Zayde discussion and campaigning of the current administration, then running against the old administration, resulted simply because they had to be against whatever the other guy was doing. And they also have a very tiny, literally very tiny. All the polling data shows we're talking about 3% at most, maybe 3.1% of Hondurans that are ideologically opposed to the kinds of policies that I've described. And that very tiny minority was very sophisticated with many networks internationally and domestically. And they used a very effective campaign to sort of get in front of the parade against the last administration and make it look as though the movement against the last administration was a movement against Zaydes, as opposed to just a movement against the last administration. So they were successful in doing that. I think the current administration has a mixture of motives. On the one hand, you can't deny the fact that they did have on their platform eliminating the Zaydes, and they did say it that way. And there are currently people in the administration or allied to it that almost every day say something terrible about us, completely libelous and false. And it really scares away investors, and not just our investors. Anybody looking at the country wonders about the temperance and the stability, mentally or legally, of the country with that kind of talk. But at the same time, as I said before, the last administration, there were bad dudes and there were good dudes, and the current administration has good people in it as well, thoughtful people in it. Our job is to prove ourselves. I mean, we do have a burden of proof. We have to show that we're not involved in any of the bad things that they're concerned about and ran against, and that we offer a lot of positive things and really demonstrate it and help them understand it. But they did repeal the Zayde framework, and the normal rule though in Honduras is that we are grandfathered. They call it acquired rights. It wouldn't have retroactive effect on us. And then on top of that sort of traditional Honduran robust grandfathering, we also have protections from a formal legal stability agreement that was authorized under the original regime. And we have protection under an investment treaty called CAFTA, which is similar to the former NAFTA, which guarantees, fair and equal treatment. And in addition to that, CAFTA guarantees us equal treatment with any other country in the world. And Honduras guaranteed the Zayde framework for Kuwaiti investors for 50 years. And that 50-year guarantee was mirrored in our legal stability agreement as well. So we have multiple layers of protection that should, and well, legally does not, it does shield us from the repeal of the underlying law. From a legal perspective, there's no serious lawyer I've talked to anywhere, and we have the best law firm in the world representing us right now in White and Case, but there's no serious legal argument that I've heard or seen or even articulated by any element of the current administration that justifies saying that we aren't protected in our current legal framework as to us. Future Zaydes, they can't be created, but as to us, our rights are protected, and should the government not recognize that, it would very greatly damage the image of Honduras in the eyes of investors across the board, not just in the Zayde framework. And so today we're trying to invoke our rights under those treaties to get clarity, to find out once and for all who speaks for the government. Is it sort of the intemperate extremists who, despite being a tiny minority, use sophisticated communications tactics to give the appearance of a majority, or is it the thoughtful, deal makers in the administration? And that's what we're dealing with right now. I actually feel very confident that the benefits of transforming, of offering Honduras access to international markets and a level of economic growth and transformation akin to a Singapore or Hong Kong or Dubai is just so attractive and so necessary that that goal and the reality that we are already drawing so much investment to Honduras. I think our investments just in Honduras are somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% of all of the foreign direct investment in an average year in Honduras. So the reality is we offer so much benefits, and the reality is that the negative political downside of upsetting the tiny 3% or less of extremists that just sort of ideologically close their eyes to these benefits are, they're so minute that I feel confident that the reasonable people in the administration are going to see through that, and there's going to be a win-win scenario.
So the benefit of ZDs to the government, to the population, is obvious. The downsides of it, well, the upside of getting rid of it is more total control by the government over everything that happens. So from the government's perspective, if you are a power-hungry faction, I certainly see the benefits. But how do they sell this particular argument to the general public? Aren't the people tired of the corruption and everything that goes with it? Why does that argument work with the general public? What exactly is the nature of the campaign, and how exactly is this being sold to the general public?
Well, the positive side of things, what we're trying to do is basically education. We didn't know exactly how to respond to the initial phase of the attacks on the Zayde regime.
If you could describe that a little bit, because I'm trying to figure out why would something like that even work? How would those campaigns work against you? Why would anyone listen to that?
You mean, how did the original negative campaign work?
Sure.
Oh, well, so, right out of the box, they had, I hesitate to call them journalists, but people writing for places like The Guardian, who would lie about everything without ever interviewing any of us or giving us any attempt to explain how things actually worked in the zone. And what I mean by lie about everything is literally they were saying that we were expropriating land or had plans to expropriate land. They were claiming that the nearby neighboring community of Crawfish Rock was opposed to us, or that we never told them that we were doing what we were doing. And they're using this to sort of invoke various international customs and practices about engaging with indigenous people and so on. And it was all lies. I mean, on one hand, they accuse us of being like radical libertarians, and we're not libertarians. What we are, I mean, conceitedly, most of our team is center right in terms of political ideology, but we've designed a system that should appeal to anyone of goodwill across the political spectrum. And we've done that even when we had to grit our teeth about it, because in any society, you're going to have a left and a right. And to some extent, it's a good thing to have a left and a right. You want to have one side of thinking, checking and balancing the other side of thinking, even if you have to agree more with one side than the other. So, we designed a system that should be appealing to people across the political spectrum very carefully. And despite that fact, they just castigated it as this crazy right-wing, libertarian thing. And at the same time, despite the fact that libertarians are all against expropriation, have campaigned against it all around the world, they said we were about to expropriate. So they, out of both sides of their mouth, they're saying we're crazy libertarians who hate expropriation, but then we're going to expropriate. And it was just literally lies upon lies upon lies. And then they also had, but it gave them credibility. So they had, this international outlet, usually The Guardian, but others in France and Germany, similar newspapers. I hesitate to pronounce them, so I won't. And they would write similar articles. And then when they got that sort of, it was particularly the expropriation, and we were just going to disregard the rights of indigenous people, and those two memes, and then they throw in a little, there are a bunch of colonizers on top of that. Even though 90% of the land in the Zayde right now is owned by Hondurans, I mean, through and through, right? Even though 90+% of the people working in the zone are Honduran, right? It's a pretty weird form of colonization. But they would run these concepts together in these international outlets, very well coordinated with coordinated terminology, talking points. And then they would have literally, and I mean this literally, 5 to 6 trolls, who are aggressively pushing this out on social media all over the place. And then those 5 or 6 trolls would have, probably a team, like a troll farm behind them. But In that, so with just probably less than 50 people altogether networking, in various places, they created this appearance of a big upswing, and then they would very cleverly, like I said, they'd jump in front of every parade. So they'd make sure that whenever there was a protest against the former administration, one of their guys would be up in front of, literally right in front of the parade with one of their anti-Zeta signs. So, look, my hat's off to them. I've actually, I had a little fun early on when I got involved on our communication side in April, engaging in debate just to feel them out, to find out who the trolls were and everything else. And I had some fun with them. I mean, like, they're sophisticated. If it wasn't life and death for, for this business that we're building, it would be, I'd be somewhat, I have some admiration. I mean, but you're talking a very tiny, well-trained, ideologically motivated, internationally connected group that just hates the idea of decentralized governance, of markets proving themselves again. They don't want to have the vision of like West Berlin versus East Berlin. They don't want to see a bunch of Hondurans and investors from around the world in 5 to 10 years prove that all you need in Honduras to succeed, for Hondurans to be as wealthy and successful as Americans, is the right free market and non-confiscatory tax system, right? They don't want to show that. They don't want that to happen. They don't want to see, 15-story towers coming out of nowhere. They don't want to have, innovative robotic manufacturing in the third world where none of this is supposed to happen. It's supposed to only be maquiladoras, right? But they don't want that. They don't want that vision because then it would drop the scales from the eyes of most people of goodwill who even are on the left, and understand, and they would understand that there's a better way of doing things. So they're that sophisticated and they're that dedicated. They're most definitely a worthy adversary, but they're a tiny minority and their arguments are weak, and we're going to prove them wrong.
So it's very interesting that you describe them as sophisticated, well-trained, and internationally connected. That kind of defies the stereotype of the oppressed poor masses that are supposed to be protesting this huge capitalist enterprise. That actually describes a very elite movement. Where would you think they would get the training, the resources, and the network skills, and not just the skills, but even the connections to become what they are? In other words, who do you think is behind all of this?
We don't know. I mean, to be perfectly candid, we do not know. So we see the phenomena, we can tie it together. I've encountered the same talking points, whether I'm talking to a retired diplomat on their political spectrum in Washington, D.C., or whether it's reading it in Spanish in La Prensa in Tegucigalpa. All I can tell you is the phenomenon is that there are coordinated talking points across vast distances involving very few people actually executing in the political realm on the ground in Honduras, but a large array of institutions like The Guardian and other media outlets, all on the same page, all coordinated in a very campaign-like way. We do want to know what's behind it. It would help us counter it, but we currently really don't have any good intelligence on that.
Well, we can speak about that more later, but right now I wanted to ask you another question related to that. Besides international media, have you seen NGOs, think tanks, or human rights organizations get involved in those campaigns, or is it just the media?
Well, so one thing that's interesting about Honduras is there's a lot of quasi-governmental and NGOs that are in the campaign, but when you scratch the surface, it's literally like one guy or two girls or three, so they have an impressive name, like the Committee Against Corruption in Honduras, but in reality, it's a guy with his laptop who had somebody appoint him to this sort of obscure quasi-agency or forgotten NGO, and that's what's really going on. So when I say there's like 5 to 6 trolls, I'm talking like those 5 to 6 people are not just on Twitter, but they're running these sort of other institutions. And then there's a number, there are some U.S. based organizations that have had a curious role in the past, but we haven't seen them engage us. And I've proactively reached out to them to try to educate them, and they haven't responded, but they haven't engaged. So I hesitate. Well, I hesitate to name them because I don't think they're in the fray right now. And but in general, what you've seen is locally very impressive looking titled organizations, in reality run by the same 5 to 6 trolls that are on social media. And that's what we've seen.
So I wanted to ask you a question that's somewhat related, but also not really, which is last year, the Biden administration in the United States put it on their agenda to engage more with the Northern Triangle, including, of course, Honduras. Vice President Harris traveled to the 3 countries, and there was much discussion about attracting investments and companies into these countries to push for economic development with the specific goal of countering mass migration to the US borders. The general gist of what I understood from all of that is that it didn't quite work out. The administration took a lot of credit, but there was some criticism of the way all of that was being handled politically, that supposedly the outreach was not sufficient, and so on and so forth. So in this context, were this ever mentioned or discussed on the high level, political level, between the Biden administration and the government of Honduras? And since then, has there been any coordination between the US government trying to push investments into Honduras and Prospera and everybody, all the other relevant stakeholders?
The way I would phrase it is this. I think the instincts of the Biden administration are dead on right. I think the opportunity for nearshoring or right shoring in the region is tremendous. You're absolutely right to put a lot of resources into encouraging that investment. I think one of the other talking points or policies that they had of emphasizing the importance of an anti-corruption push, as well as a rule of law push, as well as a legal stability push. These are all things that Vice President Harris was talking about, and what the embassy's been talking about. I mean, these are all excellent and correct policies with which we fully agree. The challenge has been the unpredictability of the current administration, and I don't fault the Biden administration for having a, at least in regards to the Zeta Institute, the Zeta matter, a more careful and measured approach. I would say that they value and they want to support the legal stability rights that we have. They recognize the value of CAFTA as a treaty for encouraging investment. They understand the importance of legal stability agreements and the ability of investors to rely on the laws that are passed and upheld by the domestic courts of a country like Honduras, like we did. They're supportive of those things, but they're still trying to feel out the current administration. They're trying to understand what makes them tick, and I would hesitate to guess at or critique more intensely what they're doing. I would say on the whole, it's a positive approach. I think that the challenge is the same one that we're facing at Prospera. Who speaks for the administration? What really is their goal? There's clearly a faction in the current administration that would love to create another Cuba or another Venezuela of old. The current Venezuela is getting more and more interesting with Maduro talking about creating special economic zones like Zetas. So who knows where Venezuela's headed? But there certainly is an element of the current administration that's very much seemingly geared at trying to recreate a Cuba Chavez type of Venezuela government. On the other hand, there's other elements that are completely pragmatic and seem to just want to have a prosperous country. And there's other elements that are very sophisticated. I mean, this is a coalition government with large elements of the business community. So as you can imagine a coalition comprised of business people, of truly sort of pragmatic deal makers, and then extreme hard left ideology motivated activists, and that is, like this. This is not a stable coalition. This is a very strange coalition, very hard to figure out, very hard to understand. And I don't fault the administration for having difficulty in grappling with that, and for being very careful about it.
So that very strange and mixed view of the current Honduran government brings me to the point about those trolls and so on and so forth. These actors, you're almost seeing or play out a struggle of a faction of those interests inside the government, whereas some of the other factions are opposed. What has been the response of the pragmatists to these campaigns? Have they been able to be gainfully employed or connected to you to help you kind of address this strange and destabilizing element? If you have a group of activists who are basically pushing one policy, and then you have a significant portion of the government which is looking for a completely different set of policies, and they're clashing, that's more than just about one company or one policy or one vision. It's about the entire government not functioning well together. What have you been able to engage with them to kind of form a coalition of your own against those loudmouth trolling kind of campaigns?
Well, I can't get into the details of that. It's obviously a very sensitive area.
Sure.
What I can say is, we did invoke what are called consultation rights under CAFTA in June. And this is a duty that the host government has under CAFTA to engage in discussions, just to find out where they stand. Publicly, there's two outcomes of this. Number one, they haven't engaged in those formal consultations, which is, technically in violation of the treaty, which is, what you would not want to see. On the other hand, they haven't shut us down. They haven't done anything, too crazy. We've had frictions, and there's been political interventions at a certain level that we have successfully, for the most part, rectified. So, our experience is that there's just simply a lack of clarity in the official position of the Honduran government. It's a sustained lack of clarity. But in terms of their actions, they're not behaving in a crazy or unreasonable fashion. There may be moments in time where they behave in a way that's unreasonable, but when a discussion ensues on just that one thing, it usually rectifies itself. So from my perspective, I'm very optimistic from those signs. And I've been beating up on the ideological component of the coalition for a bit, but to be perfectly fair, the reality is that there has been a bit of a reign of terror that I didn't fully appreciate. Many of our people didn't fully appreciate on the left, from the supposed left right. Very hard to think of in typical U.S. terms, because they're kind of dealing with thugs of one vintage or another. Really, but there is a history of abuses of human rights, real abuses of human rights of people on the left, and so to some extent, what I call an extremist person of ideologies, it's not, we shouldn't dehumanize them. They have a reason for being that way. There have been many people on the left, probably initially, very well motivated people on the left who have been abused, who've seen people disappear, who've seen people in prison for no reason, killed for no reason. That is a reality of Latin America. So, when they see us associated just by virtue of timing with the last administration, you can appreciate that they would be triggered by that. I hope that even among the ideologically disposed, that they can be persuaded that this is not the highest and best use of their resources. I really think that everyone has limited resources. They have limited resources. The Zayde, our Zayde is only 1,000 acres. It's like 0.001% of the country, right? It's not a significant area of policy control. And if they really think it's going to fall apart and it's not going to work, then they should let it be tried so that they can see that it falls apart and doesn't work, right? From their perspective, I think it would be to their benefit to let us try this out. Obviously we think it's going to succeed wildly, but I'm sure they've got many other areas that they could focus their resources on, like the folks who in prior administrations may have actually abused them. The folks in prior administrations who may have actually engaged in corruption. And those are very powerful people and powerful organizations. And to focus all of this energy that they have on the Zetas, which are not going to be, there's not going to be any more created, and the ones that exist are a very small, tiny proportion of the country. There's a mismatch. I think even from their point of view, if they really thought it through honestly and with clarity, I think they would see a mismatch in their own resources. So this is the complex environment we're in. There is, I do believe that we can thread the needle to find a reasonable recognition of our rights if we can just slow things down, make things a little bit less ideological, educate them about what we're doing. I think that even the extremist ideology or motivated folks would say, at minimum, yeah, it's not really worth our time to focus all this energy on it. And then I think the pragmatists and I think that the business community would actually come to fall in love with it as a real springboard for job creation and economic growth in Honduras.
In terms of the positive action, I have seen the efforts to educate the public on your end, videos, campaign in some of the US media. What impact has this campaign had on the Honduran elements? Because most of what I've seen has been aimed at kind of the US and international publications. And have you been able to successfully recruit some allies in the US and in the international arena to back your efforts? Sorry, I lost you. You muted yourself.
Okay, good. I got it back. Tell me I haven't been talking to myself this whole time.
No. Just literally for 1 second. As soon as I finished the question, you muted yourself for literally 1 second.
All right. Well, look, so here's the thing about communications. You have no choice but to defend yourself in public.
Sure.
A lot, our CEO, I'm sure many CEOs, a lot of different people say, show me the output, show me the metrics, show me how are we moving the ball? I disagree, just so you know, I disagree philosophically with that position at the outset. There is no choice in the political and social world that we live in, filled with rational animals, hopefully mostly rational animals, but to get your message out, right? So you can't, there is no option to remain silent. There is no option not to engage. It's just not an option. It may be that you don't move the needle, but you literally have no choice but to try to engage with the world around you, to make the most persuasive case for your position, and then you got to hope it resonates and persuades, right? But you don't have any other option. So I think that we have to do what we're doing, which is a sustained educational campaign and also promoting the educational communications of others who seem to be aligned with us. And I think that it doesn't matter if we can measure the benefits from it. But realistically, I think if we weren't out there proving our position had merit and that we're not monsters and that we are motivated by the right, intentions, and that our focus is on the prosperity of Honduras, if we didn't get that across, I do think that the tiny ideological minority opposed to Zetas would be winning, as they were winning, as they did win in a way in the last election. Because they hadn't, at that time, we didn't engage at the level that we are now. We didn't try to explain what we were all about. And so naturally they occupied that space. They made the whole thing political. The only thing that was in the public arena prior to the election was that the prior administration supported Zetas, and the prior administration in the minds of many Hondurans, maybe even, most Hondurans, was a very black mark. And so it was a failure, I think, on our part to engage as vigorously. And I think the results were predictable when we didn't. But I also think the results now can't help but be better, and have so far, to the extent that the moderate behavior, not so much the language, not so much the rhetoric, but the moderate actual behavior on the ground of the current administration, with all the problems it has, I would think is partly an outcome of our communications. They understand, we've articulated our legal theories in a variety of ways. We've demonstrated that, Honduras has a tradition of grandfathering, existing investments, under existing legal frameworks called acquired rights, which is almost I don't want to. I mean, it's almost religiously venerated among the business community and even beyond the business community in Honduras. So that connecting that concept to Zetes, we did, and I think was very effective through the technical secretary Jorge Colindres appearing on multiple TV stations and debating the issue in various venues in the media. And then when you build onto that an awareness of how the CAFTA investment treaty protects our investments, and when you build onto that, the fact that a 50-year guarantee was embedded in the investment treaty with Kuwait, that a 50-year guarantee was embedded in the fully legally authorized legal stability agreement upon which we rely, and when you bring these things out, now all of a sudden the legal arguments that the ideologically opposed present have a response, and have a very strong response, and a response that resonates at least as much and perhaps even more than their arguments. So I think on a legal level, we've really come a long way. And then on a transparency level, like highlighting, hey, you say you don't know what's going on in the zone, but we've been publishing everything on this website for the past 3 years. We have all of our laws here. You can read them. You can see all the minutes from all of our meetings. You can show up at a meeting if you want. You can look at our property registry. You can apply for an e-residency. I mean, so these things were all public, but it wasn't accessible. People didn't see them, and so we've made those things accessible and seen. And what people tend to fear what they don't know, and now they're starting to get it. One of the most important things about what we're doing is that is getting across the idea that we're a platform for others. Like, our business model is the governance service. It's the platform for other businesses, and so it's not like the critique of us from the left is that we're extractivists, that we're there to mine the resources and extract things. We're not. We don't have anything to do with that. Like, to the extent we build anything, it's simply to prime the pump to show people that our system works. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is provide the system. We want to provide the governance layer, the rule of law, fair taxes, fair regulations, no corruption, safety, security. That's our product. There's no sense in any meaningful term of extractivist that could be called extractivist. And there's no reason why that's only benefiting foreigners. It's obviously of need to the Honduran people. And we, like I said before, 90% of the land inside the Zeta is currently owned by Hondurans through and through, and 90% of the jobs inside the Zeta are held by Hondurans through and through. So I think that if you ask me, those two elements are what are making sort of this. Let's hope it's not like just the eye of the hurricane, and it's just this moment of semi quiet. Let's hope, but I have a distinct sense that convincing the influencers in the country that we have a very strong legal argument. We have a very strong legal argument, like so strong that it will not lose. It will not lose. All right. So we have a very strong legal argument. They now understand that. And I think that, even across the political spectrum, left to right or left to center, whatever's in the current administration, they understand we're not even remotely like a banana plantation, right? We're not remotely like a mining operation. We're not remotely like a maquiladora. We're none of those things. We're the system that enables Honduras to leap well beyond those kinds of businesses, to enter, to create its own Silicon Valley, to engage with much higher levels of value-added manufacturing, to offer higher tech, higher value services in medicine, so when we both convince them that we've got a strong legal argument, which we do, a winning legal argument, and we convince them that the nature of our platform is one where we're empowering Hondurans with foreign money, then that changes the dynamic.
I think that sounds great for sure, but if the tiny minority of trolls, as I suspect, is not operating in good faith, if their goal is not so much to oppose the excesses of some previous administrations and regimes, if their goal is not only domestic and not necessarily focused on the best outcome for most people, but rather if it's entirely self-serving, then strong legal arguments and even political buy-in from the their preferred government is not necessarily going to stop them. They will try to internationalize and politicize the issue beyond the legal framework, which I suspect might happen if they see that the government is being swayed by your arguments, which seems like it might be heading in that direction. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is in fact an uptick in more political activity and more broader international media-driven campaign in the future. I would be prepared for that particular direction. In my opinion, if these people are not, in fact, operating in good faith, if their goals are not to support the local communities, but rather to capitalize on chaos and dominate the resources and dominate the scene and monopolize particular ways, if that's the real goal behind the activities, then no good faith avenue is going to stop them. The only thing that's going to stop them is revealing who they really are and what they are trying to accomplish. So I think it's important to put resources towards investigating what's driving these elements and not simply relying just on your own efforts to work. It may work with some people, most people even, but if these people are as sophisticated as you describe, and if they have already utilized the international network rather than just focusing on the internal dynamics, as would make sense because it's about Honduras and not the United Kingdom or Germany or France. If they're trying to drive away your investors and cause your reputational damage when the legal or strictly political damage is not quite working, they will turn to those means much more so to make you fail in different ways. If they can't win through the legal or strictly domestic political scenes, they will seek international support, and increasingly preposterous claims will proliferate. That's my analysis based on what I have seen from a very similar set of actors, possibly with the same roots, dealing with other businesses most recently. It's not necessarily about the truth or practical reality or even about any particular government. It's, those excuses, they may be effective, but they will change their argument if they see that one argument is failing to get them what they want. If they're not acting in good faith, if their goal is not to improve and to protect people from excesses of human rights abuses, but to drive you away because they don't want you there, then the ends will justify the means from their perspective. It's a very cynical game that I think is worth preparing for. But to shift from that to your to kind of close this up, I want to ask you, what are your immediate, short-term and long-term goals, and what are the next steps from your perspective as of this moment, given the background of what you just told me?
Well, first of all, what your observation is there, it is definitely in the front, among the considerations that we have. What I would say though is, yes, we could do big things for Honduras, but in the grand scheme of things, for those who want to be abusive or to control, for the power lusters in Honduras, we're always going to have a problem with them.
Sure.
But the one thing that's going to always cause them, I think, even if they are a power luster, to second guess focusing a lot of resources on us, is that again, we're 0.001% of the country. I mean, they can dominate the heck out of most of that country, and with all of the schemes and everything else they need to do to accomplish that, I think it's very hard even for those types of people, if they really allow themselves to think about it rationally from their own point of view, to focus those resources on us. So rationality doesn't necessarily always lead someone to the right choice, but it tends to lead to them prioritizing things. And even for the hypothesis that there are some bad faith people in the current administration, even for those people, focusing so many resources on extinguishing us with all the costs that it entails, because we do have the potential of a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. I mean, given those stakes, it's difficult to see how even Dr. Evil would say, let's go after them.
Here's the thing, I'm not necessarily suggesting that it is in fact the government who's behind all of this. In fact, I'm suggesting that it may be being used by other actors with their own interests. For instance, foreign actors seeking alternative influence to yours inside the country and using governments as a sometimes unwitting proxy for their schemes. That, in my view, would change the equation a little bit, because then you're not really fighting the government, you're fighting somebody who is operating behind the scenes in the shadows and who does have the resources if they think the long-term outcome is significantly more, depending on what that country is or that foreign actor may be.
I take that with all seriousness, and I apologize if I was being too flippant.
No, not at all. I think it was a completely reasonable extent as far as the domestic government is concerned, absolutely. But if there is a foreign entity involved, then the government just becomes a useful dupe in some respects, whatever their own motivations and agendas.
Well, fortunately, we know folks like you, and fortunately, our business model is to eventually expand government as a service in other places in the world. So we have to learn how to deal with even that dynamic. So here's one perspective we have on all this, just so you know, we're building our intellectual property right now. What you're discussing is a reality we'll have to face wherever we go in the world. And we should learn how to handle it, and we should learn how to counter it, and we should learn how to deflect it. It's actually a valuable experience to learn now instead of later. I mean, one thing is, it's good that these attacks are coming before we've sunk all of our investment capital into the ground. I mean, it's good that we still have, some flexibility in our investment plans and so on. So all I can say to you is, there are potentially very bad geopolitical trends that, that could be strong enough to cast us aside like a bug. We recognize that, but we also recognize that our business is to figure out how to overcome even that. And as you can imagine, to the extent we have strategies and tactics for that, we're not going to make them public. But I do think this is a necessary experience for us as a business, and I think it's a necessary experience that will bear fruit. And I do think that, as bad as things seem to be right now geopolitically, I mean, I'm not an expert in geopolitics, but from what I see, there's no real good reason for what I'm seeing. I mean, there's no real reason why everything is getting so near kinetic in the world. It seems to be a bad set of ideas, an irrational set of priorities across the board, perhaps even among our allies, right? And the good news is, that gives us some, the possibility of these kinds of conflicts resolving relatively easily, hopefully before anything worse happens. But the bad news is that, you've seen points in history that look a lot like this. And, hopefully we've learned something from the past. And hopefully, so what I'm somewhat optimistic, even on the geopolitical scale. I'm somewhat optimistic that the differences between the West and Russia and China, and if there are any emerging out of India, will be settled. And I'm optimistic about that because I don't really see a super strong reason why any of those relationships fundamentally need to be adversarial. And I think the upside from resolving things in a rational way that gives respect to all of the countries involved will become at least potentially apparent. And I think that the downside is, like, if we don't change direction, it's clear we're headed into some sort of kinetic thing that nobody can benefit from. So but I do recognize that you're right. We're in this sort of geopolitical environment where there could be international influencing and campaigns and strategies that go well beyond what we're doing in Honduras, and we're just caught in the middle of it, and there's very little we can do about it. And well, that kind of resolves itself. If we can't do anything about it, we can't do anything about it. But I do think that we've had how many we've had 2 world wars, we've had a Cold War. At some point we have to learn from that. And I'm still optimistic that we're going to.
Thank you so much. I thought that your presentation was great. Every time I talk to someone from Prosper, I learned something new, and I certainly Would love to support your success in every way that I can, because I think it's a great model, not just for Honduras, but for many others. I hope it works out, and I definitely would like to see it succeed.
Well, thank you, Irina, and thank you for your insights and perspective and your communications vehicle.
Absolutely, anytime. And I'll send you the video later, and I hope to continue revisiting this topic as and seeing new dimensions and seeing hopefully different set of successes and goals in the future. For everyone who has been watching us, this was the Washington Outsider Report with Irina Zuckerman. Today we had Nicholas Dranias, who is the General Counsel of Honduras Prospera, to talk about that project and the challenges it faces, but also the opportunities it presents. And I hope you check out the websites, learn more, and look at yourself, examine your sets for these ideas for yourself. As a good friend of mine, Andres Romer from Mexico, actually likes to say, don't believe everything you think, certainly don't believe everything you read. Particularly from the international media, as is the lesson from this story. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next week, same time, Tuesday, 9 p.m. EST.